I inched towards the opening of the cave and cautiously peeked out. As footsteps and voices approached, I held my breath as I pressed myself into the dampness of the cave.
I think she ran into this one.
He stood at the entrance of the cave and peered into its shadows.
Hey, there he goes!
Another voice shouted a little way off. As the footsteps ran away from the cave, I sank to the cave floor to catch my breath. Hi, my name is Vanessa. Before I continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Tap that notification bell so you know when we post more bizarre stories like mine. As far back as I could remember, my father was always a con man, from selling fake jewelry, other people's cars, and even expired goods. One time, he even sold a house and land that wasn't even his. His boss went away for a few weeks, and when we returned, another family was living in his house. By that time, Dad and I had new identities and were living in another country. I never knew my mom, and he was the only family that I knew about. I stayed with him until I was 20. After I struck a record deal and became a famous singer, I moved from Dad's house even though I stayed in the same country. From time to time, I would send money to Dad, hoping he would refrain from scamming others. But I guess you can't teach an old dog new tricks. For my 21st birthday, Dad wanted to take me to dinner. I rescheduled all my plans for that day and decided to take Dad up on his offer. I must admit, I was impressed by Dad. He pulled in a limo and wore a suit and tie. The restaurant was elegant and the service exceptional. He even had a professional photographer to take our pictures of that night. After dinner, Dad looked at me.
What would you like to do? The night is yours.
Well, I've always wanted to go to Coney Island.
Coney Island it is.
When we arrived at Coney Island, we got strange looks because of our dress code, but Dad and I didn't care. We rode every ride that night and ate from every food stall. That was one of the best nights of my life. When Dad dropped me home, I looked at him. Would you like to come in for a bit?
I have an early morning tomorrow. I'm working on a new business venture.
He pulled me close.
Happy birthday, Angel.
Thanks for a great night, Dad.
You're welcome, baby.
I pulled away and walked to my door and gave Dad one more wave before entering the house. About 3 months later, I started getting threatening calls and emails. After a show one night, a man approached me and demanded that I go out on the date he paid for. My bodyguards quickly got rid of him and I stood confused, just for a second. Then I put 2 and 2 together. The next day, I paid Dad a visit. He lived in a valley that was heavily forested on either side, with caves that adorned the mountainside. Dad always chose an area where he could easily disappear if necessary. I pounded the door. Dad, open up! Now! Dad opened the door slightly, and I pushed against it and barged inside. Dad stumbled backwards.
Vanessa, darling, what are you doing here?
Don't Vanessa darling me, Dad. What did you do? I stormed straight to Dad's office and began to dig through his files on the table. There I found a newspaper clipping of the ad he posted and pictures of myself from my birthday. The ad read, "Famous singer Vanessa Lee is looking for a husband. Once successful, you'll be given a $100,000 monthly stipend. You must pay to book an appointment for a date. This is to ensure that you are serious about not only dating Miss Lee, but becoming her husband. Cost of date, $1,000. What is this? I shoved the paper in his face angrily. Is this the business venture that you were eager to get back to after you dropped me off on my birthday? Abruptly, the lights went out, followed by the sound of shattering glass.
Follow me,
Dad whispered. I followed Dad outside and through a dirt path through the trees. We hurried through the trees. The smell of sea breeze filled my nostrils and we soon came upon a bay.
Over there's the yacht. Let's go.
Dad grabbed my hand. 3 loud explosions rang in the air. My chest tightened and my heartbeat quickened. When we got to the yacht, Dad instructed me to stay down until he said it was okay. A few seconds later, I heard the engine come to life and we began to move. I was trembling when Dad extended his hand to help me up 5 minutes later.
Sorry that you got mixed up in this, kiddo.
Are you really, though? I walked away from Dad, and he didn't speak with me until we got to our destination. We stopped close to a bay with hanging trees. We jumped out and pulled the yacht into the branches before wading out of the water. I followed Dad until we came to steep moss-filled steps covered with vines. At the top stood a vine-covered ancient stone structure that looked like something out of a horror movie. Are you sure this thing isn't cursed? I asked, as I followed closely behind Dad.
Come on, we're almost there.
Dad laughed. By the time we got to the top of the stairs, we were both breathing heavily. Just as Dad was about to unlock the huge doors, with a medallion that he removed from around his neck, a helicopter appeared and men lowered from ropes held large guns.
Run!
Dad shouted. We bolted around the stone structure and through the trees. After a few minutes, the only sounds I heard were of my ragged breathing and the branches and leaves that crunched beneath my feet. Through the trees, I saw the opening of a cave. I hurried towards the cave. A few seconds after I entered the cave, I heard something. I inched towards the opening of the cave and cautiously peeked out. As footsteps and voices approached, I held my breath as I pressed myself into the dampness of the cave.
I think she ran into this one.
He stood at the entrance of the cave and peered into its shadows.
Hey, there he goes!
Another voice shouted a little way off. As the footsteps ran away from the cave, I sank to the cave floor to catch my breath. Through the chaos outside, I heard my father's voice. I slithered out of the cave and as close to the men that I dared to get without being seen.
The boss said to take him to the camp until tomorrow.
I watched as they dragged my father through the thicket of the trees. I retreated to the cave and waited until nightfall to make my move. I moved stealthily between the trees and hid behind the bushes closest to the camp. There was one tent in the middle of the camp. I didn't see my father outside, so I figured that he was being held captive inside the tent. I patiently waited until all the men were asleep before tiptoeing between them sneakily. When I got into the tent, I saw my father tied to a pole. One of his eyes was swollen shut. I ran towards him and kneeled in front of him. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll get you out," I whispered, as my fingers clumsily tried to loosen his ropes.
Are you sure about that?
A female voice asked behind me. My heart sank as two men and one woman stood looking on at me. I looked at Dad apologetically.
Tie her up, boys. I guess they'll both be swimming with the fishes tomorrow.
Dad and I shared a worried look. I was tied to my father and there we remained until the morning. I opened my eyes slowly. My body ached as I tried to remember where I was. All at once, flashbacks of yesterday played in my mind. "Dad, are you awake?"
Yes.
"Dad, we need to find a way out of here." Just then, the woman opened the tent and looked at me.
Change of plans, doll. The boss is going to marry you.
The woman cackled, then stepped out of the tent.
Vanessa, I'm so sorry.
"Dad, now is not the time. We need to find a way out." Dad and I both struggled against our ropes, but to no avail. I'm not sure how long it was before the woman entered with two men. They cut our ropes and pulled us to our feet.
Can I at least say something to my daughter?
Dad looked at me, tears streaming down his face.
Fine,
The woman said.
but make it quick.
I'm so sorry that this has happened. I've never been much of a father.
He held my hands.
Can you ever forgive a silly old man?
I looked at him. He nodded slightly. "Of course I forgive you." I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Dad grabbed his chest and sank to his knees. "Dad! Dad!" I cried. The two men pushed me away and the woman shouted,
Get him to his feet.
I used the distraction to sneak out of the tent. I darted towards the stone structure that Dad and I were supposed to use as a hideout. I opened my hand. "Thanks, Dad." In it was Dad's medallion, the key to open the door of the structure. I heard loud, angry voices behind me, but I zoned them out. I needed to get to the hideaway, or I'd be done for. I took the steps two at a time, and the first explosion rang out just as I opened the door. I quickly closed it behind me and locked it. The structure was built like a fortress, one way in, one way out. It was equipped with security cameras, a generator, and enough food to feed an army. It was cozy and had all the necessary utilities and comforts of a small cottage. I even found a wooden crate with arms and ammunition. My mind ran constantly to my father, and I wondered what he would do in a situation like this. 2 weeks passed, and I hoped that the men would have given up. But boy, was I wrong. Every night, as I looked at the camera, the men looked for a way into the stone structure, but they couldn't get in. I had to make a choice. I could stay trapped in the stone structure, or I could surrender. One morning, I stood in front of the door with the medallion, and I whispered, "Sorry, Dad," as I opened the door. As soon as I stepped out, I closed the door and destroyed the medallion under my feet. It didn't take long before I was grabbed, but this time, I didn't get tied up in a tent. I was taken to a small wooden hut. The woman walked in with a long white dress.
It's nice to see you. Your wedding will be taking place shortly.
"Where's my father?" I asked with a cracked voice. The woman exited the hut without another word. I got dressed and waited.
Why so glum? Today is your wedding day.
The woman exclaimed when she yanked open the tent flaps. She was dressed in a long red dress.
Let's go.
I followed the woman to a larger, elegantly decorated hut. Inside were a few men dressed in suits chatting and drinking. There was a videographer, a photographer, and on one side was a 3-tier wedding cake.
Ah, there she is, my beautiful bride.
An older-looking gentleman with thinning hair and yellow crooked teeth greeted me. I grimaced, but allowed him to take my hand.
Pastor, my bride is here. Shall we begin?
The pastor nodded to me, then to the gentleman. As the pastor performed the ceremony, I felt numb. I went through the motion of saying I do and signing the marriage certificate. I didn't even struggle when he pulled me in for a kiss when the pastor professed us to be husband and wife. During the reception, the woman in the red dress never took her eyes off me. I observed as she refilled the groom's glass as soon as it was empty. After about an hour, the groom knocked his glass.
It's time to make a speech and cut the cake. Marissa, my dear, bring the special pitcher.
The woman in the red dress nodded and left the room. A few minutes later, she returned with a crystal mug that had a red beverage in it. She poured 2 glasses and handed one to each of us. Then she did something strange. She came and stood by my side. The groom held my hand as he gave his speech. The men around him laughed and cheered. He then turned to me.
To us, my dear.
I watched as he raised his glass to his lips and gulped the beverage down. Just as I was about to do the same, Marissa held my hand down with the glass and then began to cheer and hoot with the others. Suddenly, the groom grabbed his chest and fell to the ground. The men and Marissa stared at him with disgust. Some of the men even spat on him. As soon as the man stopped twitching, the men bagged the groom and walked outside with him. What in the world just happened? I looked at Marissa wide-eyed.
Hi there.
I spun around and screamed, "Dad!" I ran and threw my arms around him and cried, but I don't understand. Dad explained that he and Marissa had been dating for over a year. They both wanted to get out of the game and settle down, but Marissa's father, the old man who married me, wanted her to take over his criminal activities. She and Dad created this entire scheme to silently get rid of him away from the media. So, all this was a scam? I looked between Dad and Marissa. They both nodded. And the both of you are vowing to stay clean from now on? They both nodded. I guess this was one scam that worked out in the end. Dad and Marissa got married that day, and since my husband died, I inherited an extensive amount of cash and estates that I shared between Dad and Marissa. Every so often, Dad, Marissa, and I go to visit the tiny island. The experience was crazy, but it also created a stronger bond between Dad and I, don't you think?